want to see a movie with a sad ending, Bert.
Titanic.
What?
Titanic had a sad ending.
Oh, no, Bert.
Contrary to what Ernie has to say on the subject, it would seem that most people would like to see a movie with a sad ending. Because I've noticed there's a general consensus among film lovers that the darker a movie is, the better it is. In fact, when you look at the statistics, the movies made during the golden age of Hollywood that are still the most well-known today have a disproportionately large ratio of sad endings to happy ones. And as a man who's written books, I will be the first person to admit that sometimes the sad or downer ending is the appropriate one for a movie, and that happy endings being tacked on just for the sake of it is one of the best ways to ruin a story. But I don't know if it's accurate to say that a story being darker always automatically makes it better. Because there has been many a movie out there to actually benefit from a lighter tone, or been improved by having a happy ending over a sad one. But the way people talk, especially in this day and age, you'd think that any story that isn't as dark as it can possibly get is simply not worth seeing at all, period. And today, I'd like to go over why the idea of dark always equating to good in stories isn't a healthy mentality to have. And there will be spoilers ahead for the majority of the movies I bring up. So in case you don't want something ruined, you might just want to be on the lookout. I will be giving out no other spoiler warnings in this video. Okay, so to start off simply, I've never really understood the mentality that darker automatically means better. Because the way I see it, a story's tone should be the main indicator as to how light or dark that story should be. But the way people talk, you'd think that a movie that's very light in nature isn't worth anything, and that a darker ending will always be superior no matter what. I once even heard somebody say that the only reason anybody watched Ant-Man and the Wasp was simply because it was sandwiched in between Infinity War and Endgame. And it's like, maybe people watched it because it was just a fun superhero movie? Maybe some people didn't want another intense, emotionally draining experience after what they just went through in Infinity War? Now listen, I'm not trying to say that Ant-Man and the Wasp is the best Marvel movie ever or anything like that. All I'm trying to say is that it's not a bad movie just because it's not as dark as Infinity War was. They're two completely different movies with different tones, and one shouldn't automatically be thought of as bad just because it had a lighter tone. And this extends well beyond superhero movies as well, because I also once saw something that was titled to the effect of, "It's okay to like Pretty Woman." And all I have to say to that is, why shouldn't it be? Why should anybody have any shame in enjoying that movie? It's well written, it's well made, it tells a good story, so why should anybody be ashamed of liking it? I mean, sure, it doesn't tell the most original story ever, but that's no excuse for people to view it as a guilty pleasure or something that they should be embarrassed for watching. Because again, Pretty Woman is a good, well-made movie, so it's only natural that people would enjoy it. Just because it's a little cliche and cheesy doesn't suddenly mean that it's bad. But because it's just that, a pretty light romantic comedy, people immediately write it off as meaningless fluff and argue that they should have gone with the original version of the script where it was a lot darker and grittier. Now, obviously, we'll never know for sure, But could it be possible that the writers decided to change it to a lighter tone simply because that worked better? That maybe the original, darker story wasn't as good and that it ultimately was better off having a lighter spin on it? Because that does happen. As I said before, just because a story is darker doesn't automatically mean it's better. Sometimes a lighter or happier version of a story is actually the superior one. It all depends on the context and type of story that's being told. For example, the 1935 horror classic Bride of Frankenstein wasn't actually supposed to end the way it did. In James Whale's original script, everybody dies in the explosion at the monster's hands, and that's how it ends. But they ended up changing the ending so that the monster lets his creator and wife go before blowing up the lab. And honestly, many scholars have agreed that the changed ending is so much better than Whale's original. And not even necessarily because it ends on a happier note, but because of what it says for the monster. Because throughout the original Frankenstein, everybody sees him as nothing but a horrible creature and never gives him a chance. While in Bride of Frankenstein, he finally is given a chance to embrace his humanity and express his desire for somebody to understand him. And when it all falls apart, he decides he'd rather die than continue to live as a freak that nobody will ever accept or understand. This much applies to both versions. But what makes the changed ending so much better is that in the original ending, the monster just pulls the switch because he's that angry and despondent, not really caring who he takes with him. And in doing that, he pretty much shows himself to be the monster everybody saw him as. But in the revised ending, by letting his creator go free, it allows the monster to in some way redeem himself, especially because he's showing compassion and mercy to a man he has every reason to despise. Throughout the two movies, the monster had never shown anything but contempt and hatred for his creator. And yet, when the crucial moment comes, he lets him and his wife live. And in doing that, he's able to show both his creator and the audience that he was way more than a monster and was indeed capable of humanity. To put it another way, the monster's redemption through showing mercy might just be one of the best moments of redemption in a movie because it ties in so deeply to his character. Because once again, he could have simply thrown the switch and killed everyone, which only reinforces that he was a monster. But by letting the man he hated go of his own free will, he gets to show that he was way more than a monster, which adds innumerable layers to the tragedy of his character. Because the point of the story is that humans were the real monsters, and that the quote-unquote actual monster is simply the victim of their poor and sometimes downright malicious decisions. And by choosing to show mercy to a man he despised in his final moments, the monster only proves this to be the case, showing that he was capable of far more than selfish desires and murder, up to and including mercy, and maybe even outright forgiveness. Again, in this case the slightly happier ending actually works much better because of both what it ends up saying for the monster's character and for the general theme of the two movies as a whole. Or for another example of that, take the forgotten 1969 war movie, The Secret of Santa Vittoria. Based off the novel of the same name, The book tells the pretty brutal story of a small Italian village desperately trying to hide most of their wine from the Germans during World War II, because the entire village relies on selling the wine to prevent bankruptcy. Now, even though they succeed in hiding the wine, several people are tortured and one even dies. The at first friendly German commander descends into complete brutality to get what he wants. Other minor tragedies strike, and in the end, even though the village wins, they still end up a laughingstock because everybody thinks they gave up the wine. But in the movie, however, it takes a completely different approach to telling the story. It cuts out most of the torture. The tragedy is for the most part averted altogether. The German commander never goes barbaric, and instead, after going on a few brief tirades, willingly goes, pretty much admitting defeat, and the village is actually allowed to celebrate their hard-earned victory. And honestly, I think the movie's much lighter tone benefits the story much better. Because here's the thing. The book simply tells the story of an Italian village saving their livelihood from the Germans during World War II, but at a hefty price, while the movie ends up putting a much more inspiring spin on the story, as was the director's intention. Because in both versions, the main character is a town drunk who's bestowed the title of mayor as a distraction and final insult by the ousted fascist mayor, only he decides to take his job seriously and proves himself to be a better leader than anybody would have ever thought. But while in the book, you're constantly hoping at every turn that he has it within him to stop them, in the movie it's much more about the fact that he's such a capable leader in the first place, even if some of that tension is still there. To put it another way, reading the book, one would be left feeling respect for the characters after everything they did and had to go through. But in the movie, not only does one feel respect for them, but also downright inspired by them as well. So in this case, the story having a lighter tone actually serves a greater purpose all around than having a darker one. Or to use an example that most of you are probably more familiar with, many people's chief complaint about the DC Snyderverse was that it was too dark, and specifically singled out Batman vs. Superman and Zack Snyder's Justice League in this department, with many saying that the latter was so much better because it had a lighter tone, while the former was almost unwatchable due to how dark it was. And once again, this simply comes down to the fact that a lighter tone is simply better for the setting and characters involved, and pretty much proves right there that something being darker doesn't automatically make it better. Now, some might argue that people generally think that darker stories are better because they tend to have more emotional weight to them and therefore tell better stories, as well as often amount to more in the end. But as quite a few examples I've already gone over prove, that isn't actually always the case. Sometimes a lighter version of something, no matter what that is simply better for the story. Now, another thing some might say in defense of a darker tone is that it allows the movie to get its message across better. But once again, that isn't necessarily true. And, of course, that argument is completely irrelevant to movies that don't have a message. But that in and of itself can often lead to a problem. Because, as I talked about in my video on Sullivan's Travels, which you can find a link in the description to, every movie these days seems to have some extremely heavy-hitting message behind it. And it seems that the audience actively welcomes this Because if a movie comes along that is simply meant to entertain and has no message, most will never even give it a chance. And listen, as I've already said, I've written books. I understand that most want a story to amount to something or say something worth saying with it. And there's definitely nothing wrong with that. But sometimes a movie can just be entertainment, and that's okay too. Every movie shouldn't feel they have to get some life-changing lesson to the audience across. To go back to that example from before, just because Pretty Woman doesn't have any morals or messages behind it beyond what the characters learn doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that the writers wanted to tell a story rather than get something across to the audience. And again, that's not a bad thing. But to many people these days, a movie not having a message seems to be a clear indicator in and of itself of whether it's bad or not. And many a musical from the golden age of Hollywood has fallen victim to this, with tons of them being labeled as nothing more than useless fluff. But here's the thing, as I touched on before, hasn't it occurred to these people that some people might want fluffy entertainment? That maybe they want to see something that doesn't amount to much, but is just fun to watch? Because as I said in my video on cult movies, which you can also find a link in the description to, sometimes people would rather watch something entertaining but not quite as well made over the highest piece of art out there that can also be extremely down-putting and melodramatic. Because just like how people turn to comfort food when they're upset, as even though it's not good for them, it makes them feel better, people are apt to turn to fluffy movies for the exact same reason. And for an interesting example of that, take Song of the Islands, a 1942 musical starring Betty Grable. Now let me just start by saying, this musical is about as fluffy as it gets, and by today's standards would be written off as just your amusingly bad musical. But back then, audiences welcomed a movie like this. Audiences wanted it. Because the United States had already declared war on Japan, and the war in the Pacific was already raging. But since this movie was filmed before that happened, it's set on a Pacific island completely free of problems and depicted as a complete paradise. Basically, this movie was almost like a window into an alternate reality where history played out very differently, and audiences wanted to see it. They wanted a little piece of escapism into a world of fun and wholesomeness, to see an area plagued by war where everybody was happy, having fun, and enjoying themselves. To put it simply, while dramatic movies were also welcomed, most definitely, audiences wanted a comforting movie like this to make them feel better. And I'm sure the same does apply to today, if to a lesser extent. My point is, fluff, as it were, does have a place in movies, and shouldn't immediately be written off as bad just because it wants to make the audience feel good over anything and everything else. Now, obviously, I could bring up plenty of other examples to demonstrate my point on all of this for both now and back then, but I think I've made my point quite clear. That this notion that dark stories automatically means good, and that lighter stories automatically means not as good, simply is not true and shouldn't be thought of that way. Because as I said before, the only thing that should determine a movie's tone, as well as how it should end, should be both what the movie is trying to be and the context surrounding both that and other in-story factors. Because, as I demonstrated before, when one is able to look at the whole picture, sometimes a lighter tone, or even just an ending, can make a story so much better than if it goes a darker route. And that does happen more often than people think. All I'm really trying to say is, as with anything else, the whole concept is a lot more complicated than it appears, and that maybe people should be a bit more open-minded and respectful when it comes to both movies with a light and happy tone and the lighter aspects of stories in general. Okay, that's everything I had to say on that. So now I'd like to hear from all of you. Do you believe that being darker will always make a movie better in the long run? Or do you think it's exactly that mentality that has led to many great movies being swept aside without proper recognition? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And listen, I understand that this is a very subjective topic, so if you disagree with everything I said, that's perfectly okay. You are absolutely free to feel however you want to about how light or dark movies should be and how it affects how good they are. And I nor anybody else can tell you that you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. I very greatly appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.